The conflict that recently exploded into life has had a long fuse. That fuse was lit about 8 years ago, and it's detonated a stack of dynamite that's been sitting there since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Most people have no idea of the extent to which US foreign policy has destabilized Eastern Europe over the past years. Their memories of Ukraine begin last week. You may have seen the thumbnail text and descended on this video to denounce the following research as pro-Putin Kremlin-funded propaganda. It is neither. If I'm not discussing the subversion of Ukraine by the Kremlin today, it is because I hope to cover that subject in a follow-up video. The cultural zeitgeist today makes it a priority to remind everyone of the facts on the ground pertaining to the Western subversion of Ukraine, in order to restore a sense of objectivity and balance to public discourse. Everything asserted in this video on the subject of American subversion is a matter of public record and demonstrated accepted fact. It has simply been forgotten over the past 8 years and memory-holed by modern media. These facts are simply too unpalatable for the modern political climate. Those who choose to ignore the following facts simply because they are not damning to the Kremlin, which I have no sympathy for, will find themselves in danger of wild conspiracy theorizing. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to analyse a Twitter thread from Guardian columnist Carol Cadwalader, which is, I think, emblematic of the levels of delusion to which people have recently risen. Beware, this is establishment tinfoil hattery at its finest. You have been warned. Let's go. She begins. Okay, deep breath. I think we may look back on this as the first great information war. Except we're already 8 years in. The first great information war began in 2014. The invasion of Ukraine is the latest front, and the idea it doesn't already involve us is a fiction, a lie. It was Putin's fury at the removal of President Yanukovych in February 2014 that kicked everything off. Information operations were first crucial step in invasion of Crimea and Donbass, a deliberate attempt to warp reality and to confuse both Ukrainians and the world. This was not new. The Soviets had practiced dezinformatia for years. But what was new in 2014 was technology. Social media. It was a transformative moment. Hybrid warfare on steroids. A golden Willy Wonka ticket to manipulate hearts and minds, almost completely invisibly. But it wasn't just Ukraine. We now know Russia began another offensive in February 2014 against the West. Specifically, but not exclusively, America. How do we know this? Because the FBI conducted a forensic multi-year investigation that almost no one paid any attention to. The Mueller report. You've heard of it, but probably as a headline about how it didn't prove collusion between the Kremlin and Trump campaign. We can come back to that. What it did prove, beyond any doubt, was that Russia attacked 2016 US election through multiple routes. And just one of the ways Russia attacked 2016 US election was via the tech platforms, especially Facebook. This was a military technique, pioneered in Ukraine in 2014. By 2016, it refined, iterated, and supersized these. Most brilliantly of all, they were entirely invisible. And it wasn't just Russia. Companies such as Cambridge Analytica, political operatives such as Manafort, amoral opportunities such as Dominic Cummings. They learned how to exploit a platform that was totally open. Anyone could do so, and totally closed. No one could see how. But also, it was Russia. That's what the Mueller report proves. And again, Ukraine is at the centre of it all. Read Professor Shaw's thread here. Note walk on roll for Aaron Banks, business partner and his friend, the Russian spy. In 2016, we knew none of this. Russia and other bad actors acted with impunity and, in some cases, alignment. But now, through the sheer bloody hard work of academics, journalists and FBI, we do know. But it was complex, messy, difficult. So we brushed it all under the carpet. We failed to acknowledge Russia had staged a military attack on the West. We called it meddling. We used words like interference. It wasn't. It was warfare. We've been under military attack for 8 years now. This failure is at the heart of what is happening now in Ukraine, because the first offensive in the Great Information War was from 2014 to 2022, and Putin won. And he won by convincing us it wasn't even a war. We fell for it. We said it was just ads that don't work anyhow, and a bot didn't tell me to vote. Facebook is still an open threat surface, exploited by authoritarians from Philippines to India to Brazil to Hungary. It's maybe not a world war, but the world is at war. Meanwhile, in Britain, we're a captured state. In America, the institutions of government worked. Even in spite of Trump, the authorities investigated. Individuals were indicted, charged, jailed. The hostile actions of a foreign state examined and unpicked. Not that it mattered. The US media and therefore public failed to understand the real lessons of the Mueller report. And in the UK, we didn't even bother trying. We allowed Johnson's government to sweep 2016 under the carpet. Nigel Farage, Aaron Banks, Facebook, Russia, the lot. But it wasn't just ads. It was war, and it's absolutely crucial that we now understand that Putin's attack on Ukraine and the West was a joint attack on both that began at exactly the same time, across the exact same platforms. And this new front, the invasion of Ukraine, is not just about Ukraine. We are part of the plan. We have always been part of the plan. And Ukraine is not just fighting for Ukraine, but for the rest of us too. And maybe that could be why we failed to understand Putin's strategy in Ukraine. Because it's not just a strategy in Ukraine, it's directed at us too. And that's what makes this such a uniquely perilous moment. Not least because we still don't understand we're at war. If it helps, the penny dropped for me with Skripal. Planned by the GRU, Russia's military intelligence, as was the weaponized hack and leak of Hillary's emails. Military doctrine carried out by military officials in military operations, just like the one now in Ukraine. End of thread. There is a proverb, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines it. Well, let's present an alternative narrative of events in the Ukraine, one which doesn't blithely ignore everything the West has done in the region. Prepare for a tour de force of dodgy dealing, subversion, and destabilisation. Let's get into it. The United States spent over $5 billion on influencing Ukrainian politicians and supporting democracy between 1991 and 2013 alone. In other words, bribery and corruption. While the press today is weeping saccharine tears over the importance of Ukraine's sovereignty, nobody shed a tear over the relentless subversion of Ukraine by the US State Department, which is one factor that has led to this war. I'm going to cite heavily from this article, which is a great primer on the important events leading up to the conflict. They begin, quote, "The official line goes something like this. Russia is challenging NATO and the international rules-based order by threatening to invade Ukraine, and the Biden administration needed to deter Russia by providing more security guarantees to the Zelensky government. The official account seizes on Russia's 2014 annexation of Ukraine's Crimean peninsula as a starting point for US-Russian relations, and as evidence of Putin's goals of rebuilding Russia's long-lost empire." They continue. The Washington Post asked, "Why is there tension between Russia and Ukraine?" Its answer, quote, "In March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. A month later, war erupted between Russian-allied separatists and Ukraine's military in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donbass. The United Nations Human Rights Office estimates that more than 13,000 people have been killed." But that account is highly misleading, because it leaves out the crucial role the US has played in escalating tensions in the region. In nearly every case we looked at, the reports omitted the US's extensive role in the 2014 coup that preceded Russia's annexation of the Crimea. Focusing on the latter part only serves to manufacture consent for US intervention abroad. So that sets the stage for the conflict as it's happening now. But from this point we start to explore all the sordid dealings of the USA in the region dating back 30 years. You may remember some of these stories as they come up, I certainly do, but it's amazing how they've been memory holed by corporate media in order to create a false narrative about the war in Ukraine. They continue. The main axis of subversion is economic. The backdrop to the 2014 coup and annexation cannot be understood without looking at the US strategy to open Ukrainian markets to foreign investors and give control of its economy to giant multinational corporations. A key tool for this has been the International Monetary Fund, which leverages aid loans to push governments to adopt policies friendly to foreign investors. The IMF is funded by and represents Western financial capital and governments and has been at the forefront of efforts to reshape economies around the world for decades, often with disastrous results. The civil war in Yemen and the coup in Bolivia both followed a rejection of IMF terms. In Ukraine, quote, "The IMF had long planned to implement a series of economic reforms to make the country more attractive to investors. These included cutting wage controls, i.e. lowering wages, reforming and reducing health and education sectors, which made up the bulk of employment in Ukraine, and cutting natural gas subsidies to Ukrainian citizens that made energy affordable to the general public. Coup plotters like US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland repeatedly stressed the need for the Ukrainian government to enact the necessary reforms." Now, I will pause here just to say that the analysis of economics of this article is not perhaps particularly accurate, but the point here is that there is this foreign interference with the internal economy of Ukraine by the IMF, which is contingent upon the financial assistance that the country needs to stay solvent. Shortly after his election, Viktor Yanukovych attempted to cut loose from IMF commitments and pivot towards Russia. This prompted a destabilisation campaign against him by the US State Department. Within a few months, Yanukovych was deposed in a Western-backed putsch that we call Euromaidan. They conclude, "The US economic quest to open global markets to capital is a key driver of international affairs, but if the press chooses to ignore it, the public debate is incomplete and shallow." Now, you may think that it's extreme to attribute these developments to the US State Department, but it's a matter of public record. Quote, "As political turmoil engulfed Ukraine in the lead-up to 2014, the US was fueling anti-government sentiment through mechanisms like US aid and National Endowment for Democracy, NED, just as they had done in 2004. In December 2013, Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and a long-time regime change advocate, said that the US government had spent $5 billion promoting democracy in Ukraine since 1991. The money went towards supporting senior officials in the Ukraine government, members of the business community, as well as opposition civil society, who agree with US goals. Reading between the lines, bribery and corruption. The NED is a key organization in the network of American soft power that pours $170 million a year into organizations dedicated to defending or installing US-friendly regimes. The Washington Post's David Ignatius in 1991 wrote that the organization functions by, quote, "doing in public what the CIA used to do in private," end quote. The NED targets governments who oppose US military or economic policy, stirring up anti-government opposition. Are we starting to understand why Russia might take drastic action yet? It gets worse. Quote, "The NED board of directors includes Elliot Abrams, whose sordid record runs from the Iran-Contra affair in the 80s to the Trump administration's effort to overthrow the Venezuelan government." In 2013, NED President Karl Gershman wrote a piece in the Washington Post in 2013 that described Ukraine as, quote, "the biggest prize in the East-West rivalry." After the Obama administration, Nuland joined the NED board of directors before returning to the State Department in the Biden administration as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. One of the many recipients of NED money for projects in Ukraine was the International Republican Institute. The IRI, once chaired by Senator John McCain, has long had a hand in US regime change operations. During the protests that eventually brought down the government, McCain and other US officials personally flew into Ukraine to encourage protesters. So we have numerous public admissions that the USA has been attempting to destabilize Ukraine for decades and install its own puppets. Well, it gets worse, because Nuland was actually recorded picking the president of Ukraine after the Maidan coup. No, I'm not making this up. On February the 6th, 2014, as the anti-government protests were intensifying, an anonymous party, assumed by many to be Russia, leaked a call between Assistant Secretary of State Nuland and US Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt. The two officials discussed which opposition officials would staff a prospective new government, agreeing that Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Nuland referred to him by the nickname Yats, should be in charge. It was also agreed that someone high-profile be brought in to push things along. That someone was Joe Biden. Weeks later, on February the 22nd, after a massacre by suspicious snipers brought tensions to a head, The Ukrainian parliament quickly removed Yanukovych from office in a constitutionally questionable maneuver. Yanukovych then fled the country, calling the overthrow a coup. On February the 27th, Yatsenyuk became Prime Minister. I have the complete audio of the leaked call here. I prefer not to insult your intelligence by playing extracts. Let's listen.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as Deputy Prime Minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Boak and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. You know, I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a three-way, you know, the 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got, and he's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah,
okay.
I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych did that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly side up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks.
Amazing. I have no words. Let's just break down what happened there. This is the US State Department and the US Ambassador scheming to put together a coalition of pro-Western puppets, potential CIA assets, and literal neo-Nazi movement leaders in order to orchestrate a coup against the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych. The cherry on top is that they bring in Joe Biden, then Vice President, to speak to the ringleaders and assure them of America's support. Is it any wonder that his son Hunter Biden ends up on the board of a major Ukrainian energy company, Burisma? To clarify, the neo-Nazi leader mentioned here is Oleg Tyahnybok, leader of the Svoboda Party and the former Social National Party. The impression from this phone call is that Klitschko is a US intelligence asset, though we have no idea of that. They're saying he should, quote, stay out of the government and do his political homework. The implication is that they're going to build up his profile to potentially run the country sometime after Yatsenyuk's term is finished. Klitschko is currently mayor of Kiev, Ukraine's capital city. Viewers will recall Boris Johnson's spell as mayor of London before he became prime minister. Finally, Yatsenyuk is the, quote, weakest personality of the three, and is chosen as the man with economic experience for the USA to install as a puppet president of Ukraine. They then bring in Robert Serry and Ban Ki-moon from the UN to seal the deal by providing a veneer of international recognition and legitimacy. But the media has not made any connection between these events and the current war. Even at the time, corporate media blunted the impact of the speech by focusing on another aspect of the leaked call, namely Nuland saying, "F the EU." The comment dominated the headlines, and Daily Beast in 2014, BuzzFeed, Atlantic and The Guardian all on the 6th of February 2014, while the evidence of US regime change efforts was downplayed. With the headline, "Russia claims US is meddling over Ukraine," the New York Times on the same day put the facts of US involvement in the mouth of an official enemy, blunting their impact on the audience. The Times, again on the same day, later described the two officials as benignly, quote, talking about the political crisis in Kiev and sharing their views of how it might be resolved. American democracy seems to mean America picks who runs your democracy. The article continues to cover the expansion of NATO, the use of Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups in anti-Russian direct action, the events surrounding Russian involvement in the Crimea, and the general subversion and destabilisation of Ukraine by the USA. I'll leave a link in the description. I highly recommend you check it out. Finally, they conclude by pointing out that the highly curated narrative around Ukraine that is driving the West into a war frenzy on Twitter is dangerous in itself. Quote, "All of this missing context allows hawks to promote disastrous escalation of tensions." The Wall Street Journal, on the 22nd of December last year, published an opinion piece trying to convince readers that there was a strategic advantage to risking war in Ukraine. The piece, by John Denny of the US Army War College, summarized the familiar hawkish talking points and claimed that a neutral Ukraine is, quote, anathema to Western values of national self-determination and sovereignty. If this is the story that leads to nuclear war, then thanks a bunch, American elites. And this is why I roll my eyes whenever I see Americans commenting on the war in Ukraine with the following opinion: Ukraine is a Europe problem, leave us out of it. Normally, I would love to agree. I'm not exactly a fan of American military adventures in Iraq, Libya and Afghanistan, which have been expensive and damaging to the USA and ruinous for many others. But to say Ukraine is a Europe problem is ridiculous when it was the US State Department that destabilized Ukraine for 30 years, spending literally billions of dollars on influence and corruption. They even organized a neo-Nazi-backed coup against its democratically elected president, which is a matter of public record. Whether you like it or not, the USA is up to its elbows in this conflict. You can't play power games for 30 years and then pretend your country has clean hands when the region degenerates into an ocean of blood. Of course, the American people have no desire to see innocent civilians blown to shreds in foreign countries. They're not the ones getting involved in this subversion. But for goodness sake, get control of the spooks and elites who have sown the seeds of bloodshed in the name of American hegemony.